I realize this is a very non-traditional spot to give a sermon. But before we move into the Amidah and into the Vidui, into this real work of Yom Kippur, I wanted to take a few minutes and offer a teaching to set the tone for all that is to come on this day, that, as our liturgy says, is filled with dread and wonder. I read a book earlier this year that I haven't been able to get out of my head. It imagines a world where one day, out of nowhere, everybody finds out when they are going to die, down to the very month that it's going to happen. It imagines a world where everybody knows when they will lose their friends and their parents and their partners. A world where the fragility of life and the capriciousness of it all is on full display. A world where every day is a Yom HaKippurim, where every day is Yom Kippur. As Daniel just mentioned, today is a dress rehearsal for our deaths, a day when we can no longer live with the comforting illusion that we will live forever, and instead reckon with the reality that everyone, every person we have ever known or loved will someday die. This is all to play act our death, which is why we don't eat or drink for 25 hours. It's why we abstain from sexual relations. It's why traditionally we don't bathe or anoint ourselves. And it's why some of us even choose to wear white, our burial shrouds. Today, we attend our own funerals. Today, we write our own eulogies. And today, we pray that this experience can change us and jolt us into becoming ever better versions of ourselves, no matter how long we have left. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we again and again have this metaphor of a book of life. Again and again, we pray that we will be inscribed for goodness. Again and again, we promise to change so we can merit however many days we have left. Today is the last of those 10 days. This day we are told the book of life and the book of death are sealed. And so this day we look our own mortality straight in the eye and pray that it will change us. In a moment, in the centerpiece of the Amidah, we will read the ancient poem Unatana Tokef. Who shall live and who shall die? Who by fire and who by water? Who by tragic accident and who by slow, painful deterioration? But there's an ancient recipe at the end, a roadmap to subverting judgment's severe decree. Tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah. Tshuva, the power to change. Tefillah, prayer with our community. And tzedakah, economic justice, which all in turn create a better world for us all. It's the Jewish response to facing the capriciousness of the world. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, so what am I going to do with today? So often in our lives, we look out at the world and we want to scream that this isn't right and this isn't okay. So often it feels like we have fallen into the wrong timeline, that the world really isn't supposed to be this way. This is when we turn to this ancient recipe with the hope that if we just push enough change into the universe, enough tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, that things can tilt and turn, and the world can be different than it is. So before we enter into prayer, into the Amidah, let's dig a little deeper into these concepts. Tshuva is the recognition that we really do have the power to change ourselves, and in doing so, to change the world around us. Thousands of years ago, the Talmud recorded a conversation between Rabbi Eliezer and his students. Do tshuva the day before your death, Rabbi Eliezer taught. Confused, one of his students looked back at him and asked, how are we supposed to know when we're going to die? Exactly, he said. This is the deep Torah. The real lesson is to do tshuva every day, as if it is the day before we die. One of the great and heavy honors of being a rabbi is sitting with folks just after they learn that their days on earth are numbered. There's a shattering of the soul that often happens, grief for our own existence. But once we have internalized this reality, we also change how we spend our time and who we spend it with. We change what we talk about, what we let go of, and what we hold on to. When we really know that our end is near, tshuva accelerates. Judaism has always understood that Yom Kippur isn't magical, that it doesn't atone or change us on our own. It's the work of looking at the gap between who we have been and who we could become. That is the work and the power of this dress rehearsal for our deaths. The worst moments of who we have been don't define us. Tshuva teaches as long as we use them to inspire us and to be ever better versions of ourselves. When we do a real accounting of our souls, a real cheshbon hanefesh, when we are brutally honest with ourselves about how we spend our time and our energy, we change. We look at our relationships with our eyes wide open, and we stop grading ourselves on a forgiving curve. Tshuva is about leveraging and learning from the mistakes we have made to build a better future. The second part of our recipe for subverting judgment's decree is tefillah, literally prayer. Tefillah can be a tough concept on the surface for a lot of us. Prayer is hard, and it's often uncomfortable and can feel meaningless. But this is because we put the wrong expectations on it. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was already ancient when he fled the Holocaust, came to America, and he became a civil rights activist. And he used to say that prayer isn't there to change the world. Prayer doesn't change God or the universe or whatever it is that we believe in. Prayer, when we do it right, is there to change us. Tefillah requires community. We can't say the Baruch Hu or read the Torah or say the Mourner's Kaddish without a minyan, without a prayer community. Tefillah requires that we cultivate relationships beyond the boundaries of the familiar and create the sorts of meaningful relationships that support all of us during times of joy and times of grief. But prayer also requires that we do not give up on hope. I talked a couple years ago about how hard it is, spiritually as much as practically and legally, to be the parent of a trans kid in a red state. But the hardest part of it all is how hard it is to not give up on hope. All of us face this at different moments in our lives, when the darkness seems to block out the light, and the belief that the future can be better than the present seems to flicker and fade. But our tradition teaches hope isn't a state of being. Hope is a spiritual practice. Engaging in tefillah in our community, if we do it right, is the cultivation of hope. And finally, we come to tzedakah. For those of us who grew up Jewish, we probably learned tzedakah as charity, as offerings of our hearts to help those who are less fortunate than us. But tzedakah isn't actually charity. It's actually much closer to economic justice. Tzedakah is communal progressive taxation. There's even a notion in the Talmud that we don't actually own everything that is in our checking accounts. That if we do not give enough tzedakah, then we have literally stolen from the poor. On its face, this can feel like a surprising turn in our recipe for subverting the severe decree of Unatana Tokef. Tshuva makes sense, changing ourselves, how we live, how we relate to others in response to our own impending deaths, to our own mortality. This feels obvious. And tefillah, the cultivation of hope and community as a coping mechanism for the capriciousness of life. This also makes sense. But why tzedakah? why economic justice as part of this recipe? The Chofetz Chaim, one of the most important traditionalist rabbis of the 19th century, he taught that it is always better to give a little bit of our tzedakah every day, rather than all at once, because when we acculturate ourselves into a habit of giving, it's then that we change not just the world, but also ourselves. Each of us sitting here today knows that, but for the grace of God, our lives could have turned out so differently. And all of us, if we are really honest with ourselves, know that if we are able to give tzedakah rather than receive it, that so much of our good fortune is due to luck that we didn't deserve. And so we give every day to create the sort of world that we would want if and perhaps when we would need it. For better or for worse, we don't live in the world of my book, a world where each of us knows when we are going to die. But on Yom Kippur, we are to pretend like today is the day before our deaths. What if today is our last chance to mend relationships? What if today is our last moment to smell wet earth and feel the beating rays of the sun? What if this is the last chance to hear our loved one's voice or receive their hug? Yom Kippur is a day separated from the world, a day when we live in these realities so that tomorrow can be different. In a moment, we will enter into the Amidah, into the work of Yom Kippur. And it is my prayer and my blessing for all of us that we do this work, that we commit to changing ourselves, to cultivating hope, and to building the world as it could become. Today is a dress rehearsal for our deaths. Tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, our ancestors taught us, temper judgment's severe decree. So before we move into the Amidah, into tefillah, I'd like to invite up Eli Sonnenschein, who will help us lead the Amidah in just a few moments. And I'd like to invite you all to rise as you are able and turn to page 144.